Ross, one of the co-founders for Indie Recon, and I am super excited to bring to you today my boss, friend, and amazing mentor, David Farland. David is an international bestseller who's been known for his Rune Lords books, as well as The Golden Queen and many, many others. He's also the mentor of amazing best-selling authors I'm sure you've heard of, like James Dashner of The Maze Runner, Stephenie Meyer of Twilight, and Brandon Sanderson, only to name a few. So he has for us today some lessons on how to create million-dollar ideas, and he has some real experience with this. So here we go with David Farland.
Okay. Hi, it's great to be here with you. You know, as an author, you're probably like me, plagued by ideas. You can't seem to stop getting them. And for every one that you get, for every good one that you get, you've probably got dozens that are throwaways, but every once in a while, you might find that a great idea will strike you. And the interesting thing is that most authors, when they get a great idea, I think a lot of times we don't credit ourselves. We don't even recognize that we've got a great idea. We'll get an idea and we'll think, oh, that one's pretty good. And sometimes you'll think the idea is maybe not worthy, you know. I'll give you an example. Years ago, I went to a convention and saw a genetic paleontologist there who had just pulled out some DNA from a supersaurus. This was back in 1990. And I thought, that's really cool. When I was a kid, I always wanted to make dinosaurs. And wouldn't it be great to write a novel about people who made dinosaurs? So I sat down and I considered how I would do it. And the first thing that came to mind was I thought, you know, I could write a story and let's see, I could set it on an island in the South Pacific where a corporation is making dinosaurs. And it could be about a family that maybe got in a plane wreck on the island. Yeah, that'd be cool. And they discover that they're being chased around by dinosaurs and have to find safety somewhere on this island, perhaps on some sort of a research facility that is dinosaur proofed. Okay. And I thought of that idea and I immediately said, oh, that's a stupid idea. That sounds Island of Dr. Moreau, that I wanted something a little more complex. So I set a story instead in the very far future on an entire world that was genetically engineered by paleontologists, so that we had a Jurassic era on one continent, and we had Neanderthals living on another continent with mastodons and things like this. And I had a very complex novel, and it came out the very same month as a movie called Jurassic Park. Okay, and so I went to see Jurassic Park when it came out, and I was just floored by how brilliant it was. In that particular story, the author recognized that this was pretty difficult subject matter. And so there was a brilliant part there where we had a little cartoon of a little strand of DNA who shows how dinosaurs are made. And it took the entire concept down to a second grade level. And I just thought, God, what a great idea. How simple that was. Okay. But here we had an author who understood that in order to reach a wide audience, he absolutely had to make that idea simple. He had to make it accessible even to the second and third graders who are going to be watching these dinosaurs come to life on screen. And so he basically took an idea that I maybe thought was very difficult to use or too simplistic, and was able to adapt it to a very wide audience. And sometimes you're going to have ideas like that you may be tempted to throw away, and they may be very much worthwhile. So what do you do when you've got an idea that you think really is cool? Well, you know what? It's quite simple. You've got to figure out whether or not there is a huge audience for this particular idea. and how you can create a wide audience if there isn't. For example, there are a number of things that are important for any story to reach a huge audience. I'll give you an example. One of the very first things that I came across when I began studying what you can do to grab a wide audience is I looked at the 50 best-selling movies of all time, and then I looked at the 50 best-selling books of all time, and there's something that there's some things that they have in common. The very first thing that they have in common is that I noticed, I should say, is that I noticed that they all took you to another time and another place. Okay, that element of transport is so very important that it's difficult to grab a really huge audience without taking them to another time and another place. Now, you could take them to another time. For example, you could move them back in history, 100 years or 1,000 years or something. Or you can take your audience to a place that they haven't seen before. But the big thing is the average person really wants to get away from his everyday humdrum life and go someplace cool. So when you start thinking about your particular big idea, the first thing I start looking at is, where can I set this? Where would be a great place to set my novel? Now, you understand that there's a book by a best-selling agent named Albert Zuckerman. And Zuckerman, one of his very first rules, he said, if you want to write, this is called writing a blockbuster novel, because if you want to write a blockbuster novel, you have to understand that you want to take people to places that they see as sexy. And the place that you see as sexy may be a place like Paris, France. It may be the Taj Mahal in India. It may be someplace, St. Petersburg in Russia. If you take somebody someplace where they want to go, they're going to be eager to follow you. Very often, though, you as an author might say, well, I think I'll set my story in downtown Boise, Idaho. And Boise, Idaho is not sexy. I don't know of anybody, if you ask 100 people, where would you like to go? Where do you think a sexy place would be? They're going to tell you places like Tahiti and maybe Australia, but there's probably not going to be many people who say, oh, I want to go to Boise, Idaho and go to that fancy McDonald's they've got there. So you want to make sure that you find a setting that's appropriate for your story. And you can go ahead and do that by simply asking people around you, where do you think is sexy? And see if you can find something that appeals to them. Now, understand that a sexy setting varies for different people. For example, Jurassic Park. That's not really sexy. It's not a vacation date. If you talk to your spouse and said, hey, would you like to go to Jurassic Park and be chased by dinosaurs? They probably wouldn't say that. But for adrenaline junkies, particularly for young men who get excited about the idea of seeing dinosaurs and playing with them and fleeing from them and fighting them, then they would like, oh yeah, I'd like to test myself against that T-Rex, and see who comes out boss. And so for them, it is a sexy setting. And so sometimes a very dark, how should I say it, a very dark, negative sounding place might be a great setting for you. That's why post-apocalyptic settings have always been popular and always will be popular. Okay, there's a certain population that says, I'd like to go there. My boys like to watch the Chronicles of Riddick, and they've watched them over and over again. And it seems like every time Riddick goes to a new planet, it just gets worse and worse. And that's exactly the way that it should be. These kids get excited because we're transporting them to another place. So that's one thing that I look at to create a story, is I look at my settings. And you've got to realize that in the course of a novel, you're going to have 70 to 110 settings, most likely. And so you've got a lot of room to play with the world and to create it and to think of ways to expand and enlarge your world, to deepen it so that so that your readers learn more about it, and your characters, of course, are going to be the ones who learn more about it, and they'll be the vehicles that your reader sees through. So that's one thing that I look at. The other thing that I look at is, who is the audience for this story? If I've got a protagonist and my protagonist is, say, a 35-year-old man, okay, and I want teenagers to read it, guess what? I'm in trouble, okay? Um, Teenagers don't like to read typically about 35-year-old men. They want to read about characters who are closer to their age. So a 17-year-old may love to read about a 19 or a 20-year-old, may even be willing to read about a 16-year-old, but he's not going to be very excited about the idea of reading about this vastly older character. So when you create your protagonists, when you create your characters for your story, it's incumbent upon you to look at the age of the audience that you're trying to capture, okay? And so you have to sit down and say, gosh, I want to catch females, and I want them to be, uh, you know, uh, I want them to be young adult readers. And young adult readers are typically 16 to 18 years old, but we often get younger kids down to 14 and stuff. So the agreed upon age for the young adult audience among editors in New York is your protagonist is 16 years old. And of course, if you've got a reader that is a female that you want, then you have a female protagonist. You don't have a male protagonist. Okay, there's a drop off. If a young woman starts reading a book and the protagonist is the right age, but he's male, you're going to have about a 14% drop off. About 14% of the young women say that they don't like reading books about young men. And that might not seem like a huge drop off to you, but when we're talking about 2 or 3 million potential readers, then losing 400, 500,000 of them is pretty heartbreaking. Okay, so you don't want to lose them. You want to make sure that your protagonist is the right sex. Boys are even tougher to handle in this regard. Young men say, about 32% of them say that they will not read a book that's about a young woman. They just find to relate. Part of the problem is that a lot of female authors don't have enough adventure for young men in them. Instead, they have a lot of drama, and then we have a lot of romance, and they may be trying to draw upon emotions that the young men don't really care about too much. So we want to make sure that when you're writing this, that you are writing to the proper audience. So you pick your age of your audience. So for example, years ago, I had Stephenie Meyer come into my office. I was her writing teacher at Brigham Young University. And she said, how do I write the best-selling young adult novel of all time? And I said, well, the biggest audience for young adult novels are young women. And they're eager to talk about books with their friends. They're very, very willing to share. And so it's easy to get word of mouth with young women. And if you take your female reader and you make her 16 years old, and she said, wait a minute, Dave, you said that we need to have a broad audience. Don't we have to have boys in there too? And I said, no, you can have a young female protagonist and still reach a large enough audience that you could have the biggest selling young adult novel of all time. Okay, and that's one of the things that we do. So we look, first of all, how old is your protagonist? And then I looked at how many protagonists do you have? It's possible to go through and have a wider cast, a larger cast, some male, some female, some old, some young, so that you can grab a wide audience, okay? J.K. Rowling did that years ago with Harry Potter, of course. I was hired at that time. I was writing some books for Scholastic. I did some little Star Wars books for their Star Wars Adventures fan club. And my editor at the time, David Levithan, um, I, I sent in my first book to him, and he told me, he said, "Gosh, our managing editor read this and just absolutely loved it. She said she thought this was the best book we published in like 30 years." And I thought that was nice. I was like, okay, who's this managing editor? I don't know. I thought maybe it was their headline editor or something like that. I didn't realize that that was the title that they use for the head of the publishing company there at Scholastic. In any case, so when I wrote my next little book for them, I sent it in, and I wanted to make sure that it was really good. So I would impress the editors there again, because as an author, you always want to impress your editors. You want them to know that you can get your books in on time, that you can write them really well, and that they can count on you as an author to provide good content for them on a regular basis. Okay, and he called back and he says, the managing editor absolutely loved this one too, and she has a little question for you. She wants to know if you'd be willing to look at a bunch of books for us and tell us which one to push big for next year. And so I said, okay, and they sent me a box of books, and I picked a little book called Harry Potter, okay, and said, this is the one for you to push big for next year. And we had a little chat about it, and the managing editor said to me, she said, Dave, um, the marketing department just hates this book. And I was flabbergasted. I said, how could you hate Harry Potter? And she said, well, it's just too long for a middle grade book. We can't use it. So in any case, she said, it just is too long for that middle grade audience, and so it's not gonna work for us. And so I had to talk to her. I said, now look at the dialogue here. This is written at a 6th and 7th grade reading level for most of this book. In other words, it's actually written at a much older audience than the middle grades. And I said, that doesn't really matter too much, because if a kid loves to read, even if they're in the 3rd or 4th grade, they'll be reading at a 6th grade reading level very, very quickly. That's just the way that young readers are. They either love to read or they hate to read. If they hate to read, they'll be reading at a 1st grade level. And if they love to read, they'll start reading at a 5th or 6th grade level very, very quickly. And so I pointed out to her that this was a book that was meant to be read to children, that this was meant to be read by adults. And one of the things that we saw in the very first chapter is that it opens up with Dumbledore, the old professor, coming down a street, turning off the street lights one by one with his little wand. And he stops at the house of 66 Privet Drive, I think it is, and waits for something. We don't know what, but an old woman comes, another teacher from the school, Mrs. McConnell, and they talk, and then Hagrid comes on his flying motorbike with little baby Harry Potter, and we learn about this baby who's been in a battle and killed this evil sorcerer, and now the evil sorcerer's enemies are hunting him. Okay, that was a great scene. What it did was it told us that this was a story that just wasn't about a little boy named Harry Potter. It was also about a professor, about Professor McGonagall, and about Hagrid, and about other older characters. In other words, what J.K. Rowling did was she brought in a wider audience, an audience of older adults, male and female, so that the school teachers and the librarians and the literary critics and the moms and dads would have somebody to root for in this book too. And then in that chapter, she introduces the baby Harry. And in the 2nd chapter, we get to see that Harry's grown up. And in the 3rd chapter, Harry gets on the train and he starts meeting his friends. He meets Hermione. And so now we've got a young female that we care about. And the book goes on. Okay. Now, I knew that this book was going to be a hit in part because when I showed it to my wife and my 10-year-old daughter, they started fighting over who was going to read it. And so I knew that this was a book that appealed to older females and to younger females. I knew that I loved it, and I just recognized that this was going to be a hit. So we had to sit down and plot about, okay, what do we do now? We've got this book that we think we can turn into a hit. How do we go out and sell it? And so that was part of what we did with that book. But I want you to realize that you can have a wide audience too. If you look at the best-selling novels of all time and the best-selling movies of all time, very often, most of the time, 90% of the time, they're going to have a fairly wide audience. Male, female, old, and young. You want to hit those 4 points. So when you look at something like Jurassic Park, okay, you've got the grandfatherly character, you've got the older male and the female that look more like a parental characters, and then you have the grandchildren there, young boy, young girl, and it worked great. It helped bring in a wide audience. The same kind of thing happened, for example, years ago with the movie The Sound of Music. Okay, Sound of Music has a mother figure, a father figure, a bunch of teenagers down to little kids, and so it became a good family film. And you'll see this pattern over and over again. We'll see it in Jurassic Park, and we'll see it there. Just realize that this is a technique that professional authors, when they've got a great novel idea, they start looking at, how do I adapt this so that I can have the proper size cast of characters and the proper ages and sexes to bring into my story. So that's a couple of things that I look for. Third thing that I look for as I'm starting to create that story is I want to make sure that the story has a very strong emotional appeal. I call it scoring high on the emotional Richter scale. In other words, if you've got a romance idea, an idea for a romance novel, you want to make sure that this romance novel is a 10 on a score of 1 to 10, okay? That when people talk about romance novels, as they inevitably will, that they say, oh, what's the most romantic movie you've ever seen? And you want them to mention your story. In other words, you can't hold back. The story that makes the audience cry the most wins. That's a rule in writing contests. I happen to be the lead judge for the world's largest science fiction and fantasy writing contest, and we just had our awards ceremony last week. And a young woman named Sharon Joss won with her story, which I thought was a very potent. Fairly long for a short story, but it was a very potent story. And after she won the grand prize for the year, I gave her a little hug and I just whispered in her ear. I said, see, the one that makes us cry the most wins, and you just won. And so this is one of the secrets. We look for stories that are emotionally powerful. Now, it doesn't just have to be the one that makes you cry the most. The one that scares you the most could win. If you're trying to write horror, then you want to be listed with the top horror movies of all time or the top horror books of all time. And so you can look at something, and if you get a bunch of people together talking, let's say it's Halloween, every year people are going to say, hey, what's your favorite video for Halloween that you might want to watch? And people are going to say things like Poltergeist, or they might say The Shining, or they might say they'll have their favorites. They might say something like oh gosh, losing the name here, but you get the idea. They're going to come up. Everybody's going to come up with their own titles. The big one last year was, I think it's called The Babushka, about a little Russian ghost. The idea, though, here is that you want to be in that top 10, so that people go out and either read your book or buy your book, or if you've got a movie out based upon your book, that they want to buy your video. And it keeps them in the loop. In other words, you want it to be so powerful that whatever type it is, if it's a comedy, you want to make people laugh harder than they've ever laughed before. If it's going to be a drama, you want it to just be heart-stopping in the dramatic presentation. That you want to make sure that it's emotionally powerful. And so that's a really important key, is to make sure that whatever it is that you're selling, that your reader feels that this is great and that they remark upon it. Okay. Now, when I say remark upon it, I mean you want your story to be remarkable. And the only way that you know that it's remarkable is if one person tells another person, "Oh my gosh, you've got to read this book. It is the most terrifying novel I've ever read. I literally had to close the book because my heart was threatening to stop. I was beating so hard." And they get excited about it. And you want to make sure that you do that. Okay. So that's one of the things that I look for as I'm going through and creating my story. I want to make sure that it has a really powerful emotional appeal, but it's really important to make sure that it also has the right emotional appeal. Okay. And by that, I mean people at different ages love different things. Boys, little boys, once they reach the age of 5 years old, start to differentiate from little girls, and they like slightly different things than what little girls do at 5 years old. Little boys tend to be more adventurous. You'll notice that they like to climb on things more. If they are going to run away from home, they're likely to do it at the age of 5 or 6 years old, the very first time. And so they tend to be a little bit more adventurous. Little girls, on the other hand, uh, start getting that adventurous spirit just a bit later. And so little girls at the age of 8 or 9, if they're going to run away from home, that's usually when they do it. Okay. So that's one of the things that they have. But then little girls also become more interested in romance before boys do. So a little girl at the age of 9, 10, 11 may actually start being interested in watching movies where little boys and little girls like each other. They hold hands, they kiss, they become friends, those types of things. And so we see that differentiation. But little boys and little girls, when they start out, they usually love the same things. So a little boy may, for example, be, they're usually very strong on a sense of wonder. They like stories that make them think about what it would be like if. What if I had magic powers? What if I lived on another planet? What if I could go back in time? What if? And they like to play with those kinds of mental games. And so little boys and little girls both love that. They also love humor. They love stories that make them laugh at the age of 1, 2 years old. And so laughter is a great thing. So little boys and girls love wonder. They love humor. They love horror. Now, horror for a little kid isn't the same thing as it is for an adult. You don't want to have stories where characters kill little kids, for example. Even for a 3 or 4-year-old, loud noises can be absolutely terrifying. Instead, little kids are looking for something that gives them goosebumps, basically, is the idea. Remember that Goosebumps series? The author of that series, R.L. Stine, took over 45% of the middle grade market back in about 1994, something along that line, and put thousands of other middle grade authors out of business because he was so popular. And the reason he was so popular was because he understood what it was that kids wanted. They wanted wonder, humor, horror, and young boys in particular wanted adventure. So he mixed the emotional beats, is what I called them. The emotions that we're trying to draw upon, he mixed them in just the right proportion so that he was able to gather a huge, huge audience and become immensely popular among children. So you've got to figure out what it is that your reader likes. Now, interestingly enough, as we grow up, our tastes change quite a bit. So that young women start out loving wonder as children, but typically at about the age of 16, there's kind of a little reversal. Wonder, which was the number one draw, typically becomes the number two draw. And suddenly, this young woman finds that she's as interested in wonder as she is in romance. Okay? And so romance becomes a very popular draw for 16-year-old girls. That's why when Stephenie Meyer and I talked about how she would want to write something to capture a wide audience, I said, your story is going to be about a 16-year-old girl who goes to a strange town and meets somebody who has unusual powers. And she immediately said, vampires, I want to do vampires. And we talked about a strange town. She says, when I was 16, I moved to Forks, Washington, and I would love to write about that. So what we did was we talked about what her setting was going to be, how old her protagonist was going to be, and the emotional beats that she was going to bring into this: wonder and adventure, and this strong sense of romance. Girls at the age of 16 get hit by a double whammy, where they are just drawn like moths to a light by those two beats. And if you want to write for them, that's going to work over and over again. Young men, on the other hand, are not drawn as strongly to romance at that time. They're much more drawn to adventure. They've got that testosterone that's been building up in them ever since before they were ever born. And so they may want to have a lot more adventure beats than a woman will. And so you want to make sure, if you're writing for young men, that you have plenty of adventure beats. And so if you look at something like James Dashner, is another one of my students, look at his book, The Maze Runner, that draws very strongly upon adventure. But you'll notice that it also draws upon mystery quite a bit. Mystery is an interesting emotion because from the time that kids are little, say from the time that they're 3 years old to the time that they grow up to 60 or 70, that mystery and intrigue actually just keeps on rising steadily and becoming a more and more powerful beat. So that by the time that a kid is, say, 6 years old, they may have about an 80% draw to mysteries, to stories that have some sort of intriguing element to it. But by the time that they're 16, it increases to about an 85% draw. And by the time that males and females actually reach into their 40s, we're talking about a 90% draw. In other words, this is a really powerful thing that we've got. And it just gets more and more powerful as the audience grows. So you need to look at your emotional draws and say, am I drawing on the right emotions? As women get older, romance becomes the number one draw in their mid-20s. And by the time that they're 40, though, their hormones are diminishing, and most women start becoming less interested in romance. They become more interested in mystery and in drama. Okay, so that's an important thing to know. If you're writing for, say, a 45-year-old woman, you're going to want to make sure that you're going to have mystery and drama. You might have some romance in it, but probably it's not going to be as prevalent and as powerful and as strong as if I were writing for, say, a 25-year-old woman. Men are the same way. Men become, kind of adventure addicts from the time that they start growing at 5 years old. By the time they're 16, adventure becomes as important as wonder, and by the time that they're 20, it actually becomes a little bit more important. And so young men love adventure, and they hold on to that through their early 50s as their primary draw. This is, even at the age of 50, 92% of the men are drawn to mystery. But eventually that fades too. As they get older, they too are intrigued by stories that have a strong sense of mystery and a strong sense of drama to them. In other words, as we get older, we become more and more capable of understanding life, of thinking about it, and of looking at the mysteries and trying to figure out, okay, how does this all work together? So if I were sitting down and trying to map out how I was going to approach that story, I would think about what kinds of emotions I wanted to take my idea and wrap it up with, so that I come out with a potential hit. So I look for my emotional beats. I look for my types of emotional draws. I look for the age and sex of my protagonists, and I look for where I'm going to set the book. And those are the first things that I look at when I start considering a novel. And then I start playing with ideas. I look at ways to to introduce ideas, to introduce my major conflicts. I look at ways to keep my audience surprised over and over and over again, so that from the time that they get on page 1 to the time that they're to page 50 and the page 200 and page 400, that they are on a roller coaster ride. They don't really know where I'm going with it. And I want to keep them intrigued and surprised, and really deliver a powerful ending. Okay, so those are some of the things I think about. Now, most of the people who are on here are going to be indie authors, and there may be some of you um, who are looking at being traditional authors too. And I have to say that I love indie authors, but I don't think all books are for indie authors, or all books are best sold as indie authors. One of the things that I have to do when I write a novel, when I start thinking about what I'm going to do with my $1 million idea, is I have to think about how I'm going to sell it. Okay, what is the best distribution plan for this book? And sometimes you might look at a book and you'll say, okay, I've got a small niche market. Let's say I want to write to the Christian market. That might seem like a small niche. It's actually a huge niche. I might look at a book and I might say, okay, I'm going to be selling this one. Maybe I'm doing a romance novel and I'm doing it for 20-somethings who are going to be reading it on their iPads. If that's the case, then I'm going to write a book that's going to be going out on Kobo and Kindle and going out on Nook and the iPad, and I'll basically sell it electronically, and that might be a great distribution plan. But there's other times when a book is written to such a wide audience that you're shooting yourself in the foot if you don't take it to a traditional publisher. For example, let's say that I want to write a thriller novel. If I write a thriller novel and it goes out to the major bookstores, what happens is people come in and they'll look at the novel, and as they're looking at it there and they decide that they want to buy it, if they decide that they want to buy it as an ebook, what they'll do is they'll go through and they'll take out their phone, they'll scan the title, maybe take a picture of the cover, scan the barcode, and then order it right there on Amazon.com. Okay, and a lot of people do that. Because of that, when a publisher comes out with a big novel, it almost always rises up to the tops of the bestseller charts for the electronic books right away. In other words, people who are going to bookstores and seeing a book in a traditional form basically start pushing the book, so that no matter how much you advertise online, you just can't seem to get over the hump and keep your book there as a bestseller. And so you're working at a tremendous disadvantage. Another problem with trying to go with electronic publishing, if you are going up against traditional authors, is that when you are trying to publish to the indie readers out there, we've got so many books coming in so quickly that it's sort of like it's a big pond that's filling up with water. And 5 years ago, the pond was barely there. It was practically dry, and any fish that started swimming around in there was a big fish, and was easily spotted. Now the pond is 80 feet deep, and it stretches out across 30 miles. And when you go out there and you put your book out, nobody can see it. Nobody sees you. Unless you can get on the bestseller list and launch your book appropriately, you just get lost. So it's getting harder and harder for indie authors to get the notice that they need, and in some cases really deserve. So in certain genres in particular, I think that you ought to look at, should I take this to a traditional publisher? Now, what genres are those? If I were writing romance, there's no way I'd go to a romance publisher. Okay, I just think that'd be a waste of time. The truth is that most of the women who read romances like to read them on iPads or on their Kindles, so that they can take them with them on an airplane or on a bus, or take them with them to work and they don't have one of those trashy covers on their book that they're reading. Nobody knows what they're looking at, and I think that that's a great thing. Okay, it makes it so that it actually promotes the use of the Kindle and the iPad in particular for romance readers. The same may be said a little bit of, for example, people who like to read fantasy and science fiction. Nobody likes those garish covers, you know, and you don't want people you don't want people to be basically rejecting your book. Hang on one second. So, there we go. You don't want people rejecting your book and not buying it simply because of the cover. And so, you know, there's a lot of people who say, okay, I'd like to read my science fiction and fantasy on the Kindle. But there are other books like thrillers and young adult that I look at them, and I think that the audience is so huge, and it's so hard to break in at the bestseller level in those audiences that that you're at a severe disadvantage. It's sort of like running a race in shackles if you try to go in indie in those particular genres. I know that there are people who are going to be angry about that because for them, they look at it and say, gosh, this is my religion. I'm an indie author, and I'm going to believe in it despite all evidence to the contrary. Well, please look at the evidence, okay? The average author who is selling via the mainstream right now is selling pretty well. About 80% of the people out there who've read a book in the last year say that they have not read an indie book, and they don't intend to. They don't like reading electronic books. They would rather go out and buy paperbacks. And so there's a wide audience of people out there who still prefer reading books in paper. And if you want to get to that audience, you just about have to go through traditional publishing. There are trade-offs. You're not going to get as high a rate on your royalties for your electronic books as you would otherwise, but you are going to get a wider readership. And there are big companies out there who've been working for 200 years trying to figure out how to sell books to a wide audience, and they pretty well got it figured out. So you've got to figure out, do I want to take this to a traditional publisher? If you do want to take a book to a traditional publisher, if you want to go indie, you know, then go indie, that's fine, okay? But when you do, whether you're going to as an indie or whether you're going to a traditional publisher, you've got to figure out how you're going to launch that book. How do you get people to recognize that that you've got a book out there, get some visibility, that kind of thing. And there's all sorts of techniques I'm sure that you're going to be exploring this week. But I want you to understand that you as an author have a platform, okay? The platform is simply a base readership. And when you start out with your very first book, your base readership may be 0. You might not have any friends. But as you put up a web page and you start, say, blogging a little bit and gathering friends, then your platform grows. If you win an award and people hear about it, then your platform grows. If you get some great reviews from critics or a cover quote from a well-known author, then your platform grows a little bit more. If you go out and you hit a bestseller list, your platform may grow immensely in a matter of just hours, okay? Your object as a new author is to go out and grow your platform. Now, if you're an indie author and you're doing it by yourself, you know, you can do a lot of things. You can go out and have what we call book bombs. You can go on blogging tours. You can have a big release parties that maybe you do online. You hold an all-day release party and bring in other authors to give out prizes and things like this. There's a lot of different strategies and techniques that you can use to attract readers. Okay, You can even do things like put out press releases that might go to 30 or 40 newspapers at a time into the online papers and get you some attention that way. I mean, there's all sorts, there's dozens of ways for you to go out and attract new authors or new readers. But the thing that you've got to remember that is that even if you're going as a traditional author, you've still got to do those kinds of things. Traditional authors have to do all the same things that indie authors do in this market just to stay alive. Your goal as an indie author is to expand your market as much as possible. The only difference is that, or excuse me, as a traditional author, is you want to expand your market. But the only difference between a traditional author and an indie author in this respect is that the traditional author usually has a publication department, a publishing company that's going to go behind them, and they're going to be pushing this book too. And so, for example, if I went with Houghton Mifflin and I were to write a book, well, Houghton Mifflin's sales reps are going to go to the major bookstore chains, and they're going to say, hey, we've got this great new author, and we are publishing this author as our super lead for the month, and how many thousands of copies do you want to buy? And say the head buyers at Barnes and Noble or Walmart or Target would look at that and say, this looks like a really great title, the cover looks great, the quotes look wonderful, the reviews on Publishers Weekly are fantastic. We're going to take 120,000 copies for our chain, and we're going to put them in the front windows of all of our stores. Okay, what does that do? That creates an enormous platform for the new writer. And so your goal as a new author and is to decide, what's the best way for me to go? Shall I go indie or shall I go traditional? And I don't want to sway you one way or the other. They can both work, okay? And depending upon your entrepreneurial spirit and your expertise, then you can make those kinds of decisions. Just be aware that it either way can be a tough road, okay? I've known a lot of indie authors in the last couple of years in particular who've come to me and said, Gal, I went and took my book out and I took it indie, and after 2 years I still have no sales, and I thought it would be so much different, that I would, you know, sort of ride this wave of success, and it's just really tough to do. The competition is so vast and so fierce, it's just really hard. So I'd like you to like you to consider at least exploring other opportunities. Now, if you're going to go traditional, how do you go traditional? One of the real problems that we have with new authors is that even if they've got a great book, they don't know what to do with it. They don't know where to start. And the place to start is to go to a place called publishersmarketplace.com. And all you can do is just type in publishersmarketplace.com, all one word, and type it in, and the website will come up. When you do that, all you do is you buy a subscription for $25, okay, for a month, and get into what's called the top deal makers section of that. And that will introduce you to who are the top selling publishers in your area, in the area that you're writing in. Who are the top agents? Who are the top editors? And it will give you a wealth of data on what books the editors bought, who they bought them from, how much they paid for them, this kind of thing, so that you can study who you might want to sell your book to. And this is a great place to start. You go through there, you start looking at the editors and agents that you want to contact. You can go online and get information on how to sell to those people. How do you write query letters? How do you put together a pitch package for these people? And there's great advice online about how to do that. Now, if you want to do that, and if you need more help, you can look at my site at www.mystorydoctor.com. I have a book of free advice that you can pick up there, and it won't cost you a thing. All you have to do is register. If you do register, what you get for that is I send out publishing advice a couple of times a week. And so you'll get a free article a couple of times a week. And if you would like to learn more, I have opportunities there where you can buy some of my other books. My $1 Million Outlines is one of the best-selling books in the field of writing, but I also have other books out there that you can look at, and I also have writing courses that I teach. And right now I've got a great little sale where for little lectures that I normally charge $30 for, they're up for $9.95 for the next couple of weeks. So you can check into those. And in any case, this is just the beginning. There's so much for a new author to learn. I like to try to make it easy for people. I've trained dozens of authors who've gone on to professional careers and have made literally, in some cases, hundreds of millions of dollars. And so I'd like to help you on that too. Have a great night. Bye-bye.